Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Make Your Major Foundation and Corporate Grant Applications Stand Out. My name is Yvonne Sims, Network Engagement Manager for Candid, based in Atlanta, and I'm joined by Ebony Carroll, Network Engagement Assistant, also based in Atlanta. We'll be supporting today's webinar behind the scenes, as well as collecting questions you ask along the way and posing them during the Q&A. For those of you joining us for the first time, we want to share with you that we've joined forces with GuideStar to form a single new organization called Candid. Together, we have over 88 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. We believe that an effective social sector is critical for a thriving society, and we believe in the importance of solutions for the sector, by the sector. With Candid, nonprofits, foundations, donors, and the public can all be on the same page. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects the people who want to change the world with the resources they need to do it. I would now like to turn the controls over to our speaker for today, Susan Schaefer. And while I do that, I'll introduce Susan to you. Susan Schaefer is a consultant, speaker, and author who founded Resource Partners to help nonprofits secure major corporate and foundation grants. Her work has been featured by the Chronicle of Philanthropy, BoardSource, and Candid, among others. Prior to her consulting, Susan served as National Director of Foundations at the United Negro College Fund, when she was part of the small team that designed and secured the historic Gates Millennium Scholars, a $1.6 billion program funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She writes a regular series of articles called Major Grants, and so that's what she'll talk about today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Susan.
Thank you. Hopefully you can see my my screen and the start of our formal presentation today. Thank you so much to Yvonne and Ebony. It's a thrill to work with Candid again, and on a topic I'm really passionate about. As you just heard, I even started a little newsletter several months ago at majorgrants.substack.com. It's free. It is just once a month, and really just some thoughts about this topic that honestly I think is kind of the neglected stepchild of fundraising sometimes, and that is your largest foundation and corporate grants. I've got a lot I want to get to related to this topic, so I hope you've had your second cup of joe today, or tea, chocolate, whatever gives you your energy during the day. If not, grab some of that now, because we've got a lot to cover. So thank you for joining us today. This is going to be a little bit untraditional, non-traditional, because what I'm hoping to do is cover a lot of ground, but make sure that you're engaged as large of a group as this is. So we're going to have a few ways to do that. And like I said, we've got a lot to cover, so I'll stop a few times along the way so that you have a chance to ask clarifying questions if you have them, and then we'll have our traditional Q&A at the end with some broader questions at that point. I'm just going to start by looking at the title of our session today. As Yvonne knows, we spent some amount of time trying to figure out the right words to use. And what I want to focus on are the words we chose because they're so key to what we're talking about today. And obviously, this begins and ends with foundation and corporate grants, so private institutional grant seeking. And my favorite part of the title is that word major. And we're going to spend a little bit of time at the beginning together defining what we mean by major grants. These will be major private grants. And that may not be a term that you have used a whole lot in your careers, but I've got my own definition, and I'm really hopeful that you might adopt it as something that helps guide your work every day, because I've found it to be very useful. The applications piece of it. of the title, we are not going to be too focused on the writing. This is not a grant writing session. As a matter of fact, if you are looking for grant writing resources, most of you hopefully know that Candid has some phenomenal grant writing boot camps and other workshops, so I highly recommend those. But we're going to be talking about the content that goes into your applications and therefore what makes them stand out. Because let's admit, you can be a great writer and do very well in this field. You can also be a moderately good writer but have excellent content. And I would argue then you could also stand out in this work. So standing out is another area in which we're really going to put a lot of emphasis. So let's get right to it and just quickly say that our goals first will be to define major grants, as we've discussed, and talk a little bit about why you should even focus on this related to your own work and frankly with those who may be your boss, because I think it's important to establish why this work is critical. We'll also talk briefly about the skill sets that are most useful in this work. And then as we discussed, the 6 action steps. You know, I think it's important to segment out for major grants because when you are looking at these grants, it's very important to have the strategies for the largest grants, what I call major grants, tend to trickle down and impact all of the grants related work, sometimes all of the fund development work. So I like to define major grants so that when I'm talking about them within a nonprofit office, people really understand what exactly I'm talking about. And I usually try to create a pretty straight parallel to individual giving, in the sense that major grants, to me, this is my definition that I use, that they're the largest private grants your organization receives. And there has not been a lot of research in this area. There's been a few related to kind of the big bets, which are the real outliers. But the way I look at these are about the top 5 to 10% of your grants portfolio I put into that bucket of major grants. And let's admit, this is as much of a mindset as it is a way to organize your fund development strategy. So let's talk a little bit about what these grants are and what they can do for you. And then we'll talk about actions to get more of them into your portfolio and how to make them ever larger. So very briefly, that 5 to 10% can consist of any of these pieces. Your largest private grant makers, the prospects that you also would put into that bucket. And then, as we were talking about before, what some would call the big bets, those transformational or significantly impactful grant makers. Those end up being ones that are real outliers when you look at the rest of your funding. And no surprise, most people, if they haven't thought in this mindset before, would think of the stereotypes. Okay, we're talking about the Gates Foundation or Kellogg, a lot of these legacy foundations, Robert Wood Johnson. But I just want to say that your major grants do not necessarily need to be these top tier foundations, because let's acknowledge these are probably in the 1% of all foundations out there. So if your major grants ends up being in the realm of, let's say, $100,000, you could easily be looking at some other types of major grant makers. And those might be things like large family foundations, corporations that make grants, or their corporate foundations, of course, donor advised funds, and even some donor advisors. And we can answer some questions about those if you'd like in a few minutes when we do stop for some Q&A. But really, the donor advised funds and the like, and even sometimes community foundations cause a little bit of a stir in this topic, because some organizations consider them foundations and some consider them individuals. So I'd say, just for simplicity's sake, if your nonprofit is set up to consider these as foundations, then consider them foundations. And if not, we're not looking to change all the policies today. Sometimes it's an easier call than others. But the main point here is that there's a range of grant makers, and they certainly don't need to be among that top tier in with the Gates Foundation, for instance. What we're really looking at, again, is the top 5 to 10% of grants in your portfolio, or the ones that are soon to be, because they're on your prospect list. Okay, so a quick parallel. I've got a huge list of similarities and differences between major gifts and major grants. But because major gifts is an area that has already been established within the fund development world, it sometimes helps, assuming you know even just the basics about major gifts, to say that these are some similarities between the two fields. I'll read left to right on this because the categories are made to go together a bit, but clearly both major gifts and major grants require an emphasis on relationships and listening to your potential donors and funders. They require significant lead time, right? You can't assume that a grant is coming to you in 2 weeks. And similarly, research has shown that many major gifts take about 18 months. And when I tell you some of the case studies that will help support what we're about to talk about, you'll hear that the 15 months, 18 months are often lead time as well for major grants. A number of both large donors and large philanthropies are also consolidating their awards. So there hasn't been a lot of research yet, although it's coming in the major grants field, but I personally see it every day. Funders giving out fewer grants that are larger in size. And I think that really affects your need to be increasingly competitive. So we'll talk today about a lot of strategies that you can use to be more competitive. You need, of course, a compelling case for support, a mix of both human touch vis-a-vis emotion and some very select good data points. A customized approach is obviously important for both of these. And finally, a real emphasis on credibility. And so we're going to mix all of these aspects into the 6 action steps that we'll talk about today. Quickly, I think it's important to put on the table why major grants matter. They obviously offer significant funding, but they offer leverage, and it's important to emphasize that foundations are not, by and large, risk-taking. They like to make sure that there are other foundations involved before they get involved. That becomes a little bit different when you talk about some of the big tech funders who have created foundations, but by and large, leverage is important because one large grant can lead to the next. And credibility, as we talked about, is also important. You need to, it helps to have some of these better known organizations, even if it's your own regional family foundation in your portfolio, because it encourages others to make gifts. They also enable a comprehensive approach to grant seeking. I would personally love to do a whole webinar just about this, but the strategies we talk about today will allow you to strengthen all of the other fund development you do, be it grant seeking or other types of fundraising if you are more of a generalist within your organization. And finally, these grants matter because they demand a level of service within your organization that, frankly, some of your more modest or moderate grants do not necessarily require. And that is, these groups really consider themselves investors in your mission. So you've got to be looking at your work through an investor's lens. They require some clear direction. We're going to talk very explicitly about this in a few minutes. And stellar customer service. because these groups really demand that they be your partners. So again, these are pieces that, of course, are phenomenal if you can see them through all of your grants and grant makers. But in particular, for those major grants, these are pieces that really matter, because you want to be telling these grant makers that they are very important to your work and your mission, and you need to show them how important they are through these pieces. So again, the term major grants for me allows staff at nonprofits to help make the case that the things we're about to talk about are necessary, because our largest grant makers demand and require a certain level of both service and performance on our part as nonprofits. Okay, so with that, I just want to pause for a minute to see if there are any questions or thoughts you have. These are the topics that we've covered so far, and I'll just go to you, Yvonne and Ebony, to see if there are any clarifying questions we should answer at this point.
Sure. Janice had a question, wanted to know, can strategy be the dates the grants are open to write?
I want to make sure I understand that. The dates that the grants are open?
Yeah, so when you were saying, did they have particular strategies? I think she was wondering, or Janice was wondering, can strategy be just the dates, around when grants are open?
Got it. I'd say those might be supporting your strategies. And Janice, if you're a little unsure of what the strategies might be, hold tight, please, because I'm about to give you a whole list of some strategies along with some actionable tasks that will support the strategies. So I'd say, sure, the dates are clearly important, but they probably guide the strategies as opposed to encompass them.
Okay. And Leslie wanted to know, what do you mean by demanding service?
Yeah, so I think that came down to the investor lens that we were talking about. And so I think that when you're talking with major funders, if they, let's say they call you and need the answer to a couple of questions, means we're probably going to put them higher up on our priority list of tasks than we might if, let's say, it was a smaller grant maker that contacted us, because we realized that the partnership is significant and these really are investors in our long-term mission, and ideally they're supporting a fair amount of the work to be done. Does that help?
Yeah, I think it does. And then Alex wanted to know, what do you mean by top 5 to 10% of grants we receive? For example, if we have two organizations that give $1 million and then the next biggest is 150,000, would the few that are 150,000 also be considered?
Yes, exactly. So this is where we were talking, Alex, about the outliers. So if you have that $1 million grant, maybe even two, they certainly would be considered major grants. But I don't want to exclude the $100,000 funders, because they stand to potentially be your next $1 million funders. So I'd say I put the 5 to 10% of them into a similar bucket, but absolutely you're going to look at those outliers a little bit differently and put a little more emphasis for sure on them. But I don't want to ignore the fact that you do have a group of funders that is still giving at a decent level, and that they stand to become your next outlier funders as well.
Thanks.
And Alex, you're asking some good questions, so if you need more clarity to that, keep asking them. Thank you.
Okay, and then Catherine said, so what if a major grant wants to remain anonymous concerning leverage?
Yeah, it's a good point. Some of them do, and I think just having them on your website, on your materials, and showing that there are people making a grant at a certain size vis-a-vis an anonymous funder, I think is important. And I think you can ask. Sometimes they don't want to be known publicly, but we can have conversations with them behind the scenes about ways in which they might enable us to utilize their names if it means introductions to other funders, or in what context they might want us to or enable us to use their names. If it's none at all, then obviously that's their prerogative. But I think sometimes if all we can get is just showing other funders that we've got people who give at a certain level, that's great. Sometimes I've seen funders also enable a description of the organization that they represent. So it might be $100,000 from a regional family foundation. And if that's all they'll give you, that's obviously all you can take. But yes, leverage will be somewhat less important if the grant must be anonymous.
And Tracy had a related question. Tracy wanted to know, how do you use a grant to leverage other grants? List them in the application, post about them on social media. How does one funder know what other support you've received?
Yes, all of the above. And sometimes even mentioning them in applications, because these funders, especially within particular disciplines, let's say you're in the criminal justice field, those funders all talk to each other. And so if you have room to even enter them in your application at all, some of your major donors, they will talk to each other. And that's why, again, that performance is so important, because when you respond very diligently to one funder, they'll talk very highly about you to another. And so that becomes critical.
Another question, would you say that it takes just as much work to prepare a $25,000 grant versus a $100,000 grant for a foundation? We do categorize
Sometimes,
individual donors versus foundations. I'm curious as to what you mean by strategy or approach by grant amount.
yes, so sometimes they certainly do take the same amount of time, and when you get to a certain point, you really got to make decisions about those smaller grants, and frankly, whether they're worth the time when they require a lot of time. Hopefully you're on the other end of things, where your $100,000 grant is as simple to put together as the $25,000 grant. So there can be a lot of strategy there, and I hope that the pieces we're about to start outlining will help answer the second part of your question. So if not, please circle back at the end.
Yeah, another question came in about donor advised funds versus donor foundations. Is that something you're about to cover?
No, not necessarily. So feel free.
Okay, so the question was, can you clarify between donor advised funds and donor foundations?
Yeah, so I think the term I might have used was donor advisors on that slide. In that, for instance, I just worked with a client to put together a big proposal for their, it's an advisor to a philanthropy. So it's in essence an individual on the other end of this call. So the client was talking to a donor advisor who works for a firm that manages individuals' foundations. So that's a bit of a disconnect maybe from the nonprofit to finally the foundation, the donor who is pouring money into that foundation, but an acknowledgement that sometimes you're working with a Fidelity Investments or a community foundation or a donor advisor who is helping these foundations create their strategies.
Okay.
So I think that was just top of mind because I've been working with one recently, but they're proliferating.
Gotcha. Trisha wants to know, can major grants include government grants, especially the past year where we've received transformational federal grants?
Yeah, so for the purposes of what we're talking about today, we're just talking about private grants, although a lot of these things will still apply to government grants. So I think your office will have to figure out, does it get enough government grants where you really want to put them in their own bucket where you've got major private grants and major public grants separately in 2 different buckets? Do you want to put them together in one? I think it really depends how your office segments its workflow, to be honest. I wonder, Yvonne, if we, I'm so thrilled with all the questions. I wonder if we should move on, unless you
Yeah,
just
I think we have some more general questions, and we'll definitely get to them in our next segment. But thank you.
Okay, great. And let me say to everyone, you'll get my email address at the end of the session. If there's anything we don't get to, I would be more than happy to answer any lingering questions at the end, but hopefully many of them get answered in the next few minutes. So let's move on to the bulk of where we're going today. I want to say really briefly to introduce our next section that most of you know the skills needed to secure major grants go well beyond writing and building rapport. So I think this is a good acknowledgement for those of you who are doing hiring or just thinking about the skills maybe you want to develop further in yourself, that I find that communication is clearly important to this work, but planning, perseverance, and leadership are also incredibly central. And we're going to touch on each of these as we go through the rest of the work today. Development planning is, yes, important, but beyond that, organizational planning, we'll talk about perseverance, in part because there have been some studies, Bridgespan has done some studies on those outlier big bet grants we just talked about that show that it takes quite a few grants until you land on a very large one of that size. So I think sometimes I extrapolate and just look at the anecdotal evidence I've seen, which is that if you want a major grant, often you need to secure some more moderate grants in the process of getting there. So perseverance is important. And leadership is going to be an ongoing theme for the rest of our time together. So you'll see whether you agree with that. I think you really need to have a say in a lot of what goes on at your organization to be able to secure, as Alex was saying, those real outlier type of grants. Okay, so now we're getting into the nitty-gritty on how you can make your private grants, major private grants that is, stand out. In my experience, what makes them stand out is the quality of the content, right? So the writing, yes, the rapport, absolutely. But I think it is this content piece that doesn't always get talked about enough. And we're not only talking about, let's say, a programmatic grant and that program's design, but so many other pieces that fall around that. So we're going to spend the rest of our time together talking about how to get what you need out of your office so that you can make all of those written and verbal communications with a funder stand out, sing out, and stand out. So there are 3 categories, I think, that allow your grant applications to stand out: awareness, aspiration, and advocacy. We're going to define each of those, but it's worth saying that within each of these, there are really 2 categories, and these won't surprise most of you. There is, this to me just encapsulates all of it. There's looking at your organization from the inside, and then those, vis-a-vis the funders who are looking at your organization from the outside. What is going on inside that you can control and help mold for the purposes of your major grants, and what is it that that is being looked at from the outside? So we're going to talk about those 3 categories today: awareness, inspiration, and advocacy, from an internal lens and from an external lens. Because in my experience, it takes the more of these pieces that you can really capture internally, the more and the larger your major grants will be. So this sounds like a lot. If your organization is newer to major grants, you may not have all 6 of these in the works, and that's fine. But that's why I think it's really important to customize your plan. This is going to be a bit nuanced. It's going to be customizable But think as we go along here about what you can do for your organization to take it to that next level, so that if you're at $50,000 is your major grant level right now, how can you get yourself to 75 or 100,000? If yours are currently at the $2 million level, how can you push yourself further than that? Okay, so here's the matrix, and with each, as we talk about each of these 6, I'd love you to think about some of the examples I'm giving through case studies and through a list of examples at the end of each section, and just jot down what you personally could be doing next to bring your organization along to its next level major grants. All right, so now we're on the internal side here. So from the inside, we start out with what does it take to build organizational health, right? Because that's really what underpins major grants. And this is why it all requires leadership. Investors obviously want to be confident in the way in which your nonprofit stewards its funds. And so whether they are asking directly or not, you really want to be able to show your funders how you are engaged within a healthy nonprofit organization. So on the awareness end of that, your teammates need to be aware of what you're doing as a major grant seeker. And they need to be aware, frankly, of that term, about this category of grants that you're working with and why it's so critical. And that could mean a couple different things depending on how far along your nonprofit is in its own grant seeking. It might mean that your colleagues need, frankly, a general education about what are grants and why do I, as the program director or the chief financial officer, or even sometimes the executive, the CEO, why do I need to be involved in the major grants process? Why do they benefit the organization? What does it mean to secure a grant of this size? I like to occasionally bring colleagues together to discuss these topics, especially, again, if we're pushing to new heights. I like to call them grant gatherings. And it might mean talking about those broad topics we just mentioned, or it might mean that a request for proposals has just been issued from a large funder, and you want to rally your colleagues together and give everybody kind of both an informational session on that particular application, as well as almost a little pep rally to get them excited about what this potential grant might mean if your organization secures it. So here's a little case study about how these things can work. My work with one client began where the lead grant seeker was a little bit frustrated that she was fairly new to the organization. They were also fairly new to grants, and she was having a hard time corralling everyone and getting them on the same page when it was time to submit an application. Because obviously she needed input from many different people. It wasn't coming, or it wasn't coming in the detail in which she needed it. So what we needed to do is help show her colleagues how crucial their work was to her success and why her success mattered so much to them. That's going to sound very basic to some of you, and some of you, it may just sound like, well, that's my daily grind. So what we did was that we created two types of sessions. One was a very general grant gathering where we talked about all the topics I just mentioned. What are major grants? What can they do for our organization? Why do we need input from those of you in this room? This was not an all-staff meeting. She invited the people very specific to the bulk of her major grants and grant writing initiatives. And so she answered questions and just got everyone on the same page, talked about systems. And that was one bucket and might be for your organization. And then what she did was figured out a forum, an agenda that she would use and we would use for specific new major solicitations when it was time for them. So that if we knew that a funder had March 1 opening of its next window for a major grant, we would call those players together, the relevant ones anyway, and talk about what they would need, what would be needed for that particular grant, what we'd be applying for, allow for a little dialogue, so that before everyone launched in, we were all in agreement on what the proposal would be about and everyone was on the same page. So, when you look at that, the matrix that I gave you under the internal awareness block, the question that you'll want to answer there is, internally for you, how will you make your applications stand out internally on an awareness level? So what this means is getting your team together to gel around the grant's function and or getting them to gel around specific applications. So the question you might answer there is, number one, would your office benefit from a very general type of grants gathering? And might it be its own forum? Or is there some kind of regular meeting of those players where you might plug in? So will you discuss major grants broadly, or is your organization at a point where you can really start drilling down into specific grant solicitations that are coming up? You might also jot down a few people that you would invite to that gathering. And are there other methods that you would use to educate people in your office? Because maybe there's already a platform, an internal publication, something else where people would look for information like that. So just jot down a couple of notes if anything that I just mentioned would ring a bell, would allow you to build on your internal awareness efforts, because I think most of you would nod in agreement that the more you can get internal buy-in, the easier it is to create solid applications. Okay, aspiration. This is where we talked earlier about planning, and particularly organizational planning. I know a lot of us think of strategic planning or something similar and it leaves a bad taste in your mouth, but whether it's strategic planning or strategic thinking or visioning, it really helps on these larger grants to have a basis for which you are injecting a large proposal into a context that your organization has already created. So in other words, a program is not coming out of thin air, but you're describing how this program fits into your nonprofit's longer range plans. And when I am working with new organizations, there is an absolute correlation between the strength of those plans and their success in major grants. And I know that foundations don't always ask very explicitly for you to correlate the two, but I'll tell you, it really makes a difference in your applications when you can describe to a funder how closely a proposed project is tied to a larger organizational plan. So let me give you a little case study again, because that might help clarify some of what we're talking about. Another organization that I worked with had so many great ideas and had been submitting them to funders and were not terribly successful. So I was a little surprised myself when I first read some of their proposals. I thought, these are really strong. Why are they not getting enough traction? And when I started asking questions, and one of my early questions is always about planning efforts, they really did not have a strong planning component. So I suggested that I, as their major grants consultant, step back for a while and allow them to do some strategic work. And again, this does not have to be a 9-month horrific, some people would call it, planning effort. It can be whatever your organization thinks it needs to get some plans that create some context. So we found them a good strategic planning consultant. They had a succinct but really powerful plan that came out of it. And then we were able to look at all of their many good ideas for programmatic and even some unrestricted proposals, and plant them in to this plan and figure out, okay, what is the order of things? Which of these should come first and which have the strongest correlation to that plan? And sure enough, many of these funders that had been prospects for years very quickly came on board and were excited to really see the vision. So that said, it's important there are a few caveats when we talk about planning, because some of you may have a plan and think, we have one, but it's not terrific. So what can you do about all of this to make your application stand out? It is core, in my experience, to have not just a plan, but a fairly solid plan. And this is where your leadership as a grant professional comes into play, because it's something that we often need to push for. We'll talk about that momentarily. But when you look at your matrix, think about this. Does your organization utilize some kind of planning framework, whether that's strategic planning, strategic thinking, visioning, or one of the many other forms that takes these days? If you don't have that kind of planning framework, are you willing to go to bat for it, to start saying that this is really what we need to help us with our major grants efforts? And what can you do to help get your hands on a framework that helps you make your case? So, that might mean going to the CEO. It might mean that you yourself are responsible for talking to some people who can help you generate the plan. If you do have a plan internally, are you using it to create a context for your proposals? Because sometimes it's easy to, as the saying goes, put it on a shelf. And I really think it is something that even when we're not asked for it, we want to work it in to our applications. It also shows the funders that we're thinking about the long game as a nonprofit. And if you do have a plan of any sort and it's not great quality, what can you do to help bolster it? Can you work with staff internally to tweak it? Do you need some kind of abbreviated pause where you can really look at it with fresh eyes? We've all been through so much the past couple of years that a plan that might have looked great a year ago would look very different now. So it might need some refreshing. So where are you in the planning, and what can you do to help move your nonprofit to the next level? And then finally, we just hinted at this, but advocacy when it comes to your internal work, for me, means some advocacy for your needs. And those might be planning needs, they might be other types of needs. The easiest way I can demonstrate this is to talk about another very discrete example, and that was of a phenomenal young professional I worked with several years ago, who did not really consider herself a particularly good writer, and she still excelled at major grants. The reason, I think, was that she was a terrific advocate for herself. So this bucket of advocacy I like to think of as self-advocacy or grants advocacy. And I've seen this happen many times. I won't spend too much time on it, but think about some of these things I'm about to mention and whether they might help you in your efforts. So this young woman advocated for herself. We'll call her Yvette. She spoke up for what she needed internally. And at first that was, she really knew that she needed to improve her writing skills. So she took some grant writing courses, and that was when she first moved into her role as a grant professional. And then her income goals increased, and she realized that she needed some additional support. And that's when she and I met to help her work on her major grants and move her to a higher level. So at that point, she was obviously requesting additional professional development. Together, we built out the strategies, the messages, the relationships that she needed to move things forward. And she did, but her advocacy was still not finished because as the income began to grow and grow very quickly at that point, she really needed to recognize that as her goals were growing larger, she needed different things from her leadership. She needed strategic thinking sessions. She needed added staff. It was in the form of a part-time grant writer at that point. And, it kind of went on from there. So she was very clear about what she thought she could achieve with each next piece that she advocated for. And I do find that as a really important piece to making this major grants piece successful. It's sometimes clearer, I think, on the major gifts side, what staff needs. And so I find that sometimes we grant seekers really need to push a little bit to get what we think we need. So the question for you is how to make your application stand out. What is it that you need right now to take your major grants to the next level? And that might be things like specialized training, could be human resources to help lift the burden of the more moderate grants that are weighing you down. Or maybe you've got some tasks on your responsibility list that are less income focused, and maybe your leadership would be okay with moving some of those out of your responsibility realm so that you could focus more on these larger grants. And I'll just say briefly, you could jot down too, who are your internal allies who might be willing to help you with that momentum? Who do you go to make these asks, or who could help you make your case? So with those internal pieces, I will stop for a few minutes to take some questions related to these internal aspects. I know we're going through these quickly, but there's so much to say on each one, and I find each of them really key. So I'll stop for maybe 5 minutes or so to say, Yvonne, if we've got other questions that are worth addressing.
We do, definitely. So you were talking about kind of the process and meetings, and Owen wanted to know how far in advance would you suggest having those meetings with colleagues preparing for a specific proposal?
Yes, well, we all know that sometimes that is relative, Owen, right? If you know that a particular grant cycle is coming around again, I like to do it in the week or so leading up to the time that we know that the grant cycle will open. It just kind of gets things on people's radar screens, allows them to put a little time aside, and importantly, I think gives you some time to schedule meetings with people if you need to, so that you're not just bumping up against a deadline. So a week or two before the grant cycle opens is great, and then you give yourself plenty of time to put the proposal together before a deadline.
Great, thank you. And then in terms of self-advocacy, Marianne wanted to know, do you have any tips for encouraging the board to take seriously recommendations by the development staff? This might be a very loaded question regarding things like strategic planning or something else that is organization-wide.
Marianne, I'm so thrilled that you brought up the board. I didn't know if I'd have time to mention them, but sometimes I think these, grant gathering type ideas can be great for a board because they often think that grant seeking is easy money and they don't often understand it in the same way where, we all know that stereotype where people are yelling out at board meetings, why don't we just ask Oprah for money? Why don't we just ask Bill Gates for funding from his foundation? And so sometimes they really need an education in this sort of thing too. And that's no disrespect to them. It's just that many board members don't come from the nonprofit sector. So I think all of these pieces are so key because if you conduct that kind of grant gathering, and it may just be part of a board meeting with your trustees or your board members, it gives them an opportunity to see why the dreaded strategic planning, which many board members, let's face it, don't love, is so important to your work. So I 100% agree with your angle on that.
Wonderful. Thank you. I know boards are always, there's always a lot of questions about boards. So um, thank you for covering that. And then in terms of, I'm guessing maybe these are smaller or newer organizations. Margaret says, any suggestions on creating a strategy for a nonprofit that has never won a grant, but has some success with sponsorships and fundraising?
Yes, well, actually, that's exactly the right step to take. If you have some success with fundraising and sponsorships, I think those are often great first benchmarks to get yourself to the grants. We talked earlier about leverage, and many grant makers don't want to make grants until they see that there's been some other income, especially philanthropic income. So I think those are absolutely the first place to start. And then you can include those in your proposals to let funders know where you're going. And your major grants initially, let's face it, may not be huge. However, you just continue to move yourself up the scale, up the ladder in the ways that we're talking about. And then all of these strategies will work for you in the same way.
Great. And then Leah says, what would you do if a new major funder gave you 3 weeks to submit a proposal? Extension of the deadline was not granted.
Sometimes, in my experience, 3 weeks feels like an eternity. I've been given days in some cases. So I know I'm not trying to make light of your situation because we all have our own complications, but let's face it, sometimes there's just not a lot you can do. And I know current circumstances with so many being out and sick with COVID and all sorts of other things are making what used to seem like lots of time feel like it's just impossible now. So I think you've done all you can do if you've asked for an extension. And beyond that, I think you just unfortunately make do. But I will say on the plus side that all of the things we're talking about today are designed for long-term grant preparation. So if you get your colleagues on board, if they're educated, if you've got plans in place, all of these pieces, in addition to the ones we're about to talk about, will allow you to feel a little bit less stress each time the next deadline comes around.
Thank you. That's really great. Alex wants to know, and I guess this is within the context of what we're talking about today, not maybe generally, but how often should a strategic plan be developed? At what point is a strategic plan old?
Yeah, I think that the window on those is shrinking. It used to be 5 years was sometimes a good average. Now 3 sounds sometimes like a lot. I'm seeing groups do them for 2 years. 2 to 3 is probably the average. And the important part, again, is that they just get looked at regularly so that if pieces of them become outdated, you make sure that there are processes in place that ensure that they're getting revised.
Great. And just one
So
more kind of a combo. Greta and Anjum were both curious about, what do you do when a foundation is not taking, they say they're not accepting unsolicited proposals, or that they conduct their own landscape analysis and they're unresponsive. What do you think about that? And this was around when you were talking about relationships.
yes, I'm so glad, Yvonne, you saved that question for last because it's a perfect bridge
Oh,
into what
good.
we are going to talk about right now. And that is that, look, sometimes you can't do anything but attempt to get yourself onto that list of invited applicants, right? And what better way to do that than with awareness? So we're going to start out by talking about this external lens that we promised a minute ago. And this, just as a reminder, is how you can make your major grants effort stand out from the viewpoint of your funders. And when we're talking about applications that where you must be on an invitee only list, the best thing you could do is make sure those funders know about you. So they're telling you not to apply, but it's not to say you can't wave a flag around in some other way. So everything I'm about to say applies to those funders. So that's the answer to the question. You can ask a follow-up if you need to later, but this will pretty directly answer the question. When we're talking about awareness, and I think this matters whether you're invited or not to apply, meaning even if it's an invitation that's open to all. The question is, obviously, how do you get your funders to become familiar or at least aware of your organization? Because it really is key. It's true that you won't always get a meeting with your funder before you submit an application, but the more you can be sure that a funder has seen you, and I put that in the little air quotes, that they have seen you in the sense that they have seen your organization name or your own name pop up in the course of their work, the better your chances to be recognized and get at least an eyebrow raise when you submit a grant. And this is also how you become known to those funders who only invite their applicants to apply. And I'll say, for understandable reasons, too many organizations skip this step of trying to make funders aware of them. And I know it's frustrating when you don't get a response, and we'll discuss how to deal with that in a few minutes. The first step is to just recognize that it's important to socialize your organization and ideally the project, if it's a project grant, with your contact or a contact, so that when that person later sees your application, they feel some air of familiarity with your work. Now remember, this seems overwhelming if you think about your entire portfolio, but we're only talking about that top 5 or so % of your foundation work. So we're not talking that the steps we're about to talk about don't apply to every solicitation, just the largest. So here's, again, a real concrete example. I can't tell you the number of new clients I've met with who will tell me in a first meeting that they are the best kept secret in their respective fields. And what I say to them is that it does really matter that they find ways to get in front of funders. You can do it through strategic emails that are sent in the lead up to a proposal. You can do it through connections. You can do it through voicemails. And in one example, when I started working with a youth-oriented program, I asked my little battery of questions early on, and sure enough, the staff had been diligent about sending out introductory emails to each of its larger prospects. So I was very happy to hear that. But when we got into the weeds, I asked to see some of those messages they had been sending, and each was about 4 to 6 paragraphs long, and many of them were long paragraphs. And I don't blame them for that approach. They felt that there was so much for them to say and so much they had done recently that this funder would be excited about. But it was really much more than those program officers needed at that early stage. And think about your own inbox, right? We're all inundated. And that's often just from our own colleagues. So here's people taking incoming from the outside, and they were just really overwhelmed. Program officers, when I talk to them, are often just deluged, of course, with information and inquiries. So what we did with this client was really just rework those introductory emails, among other things. And we pivoted to a style of writing that mimicked a little bit of direct mail style writing. And we got much better traction with that because the style was punchy, it was direct, and most importantly, it was brief. And what came out of it, we took out of those 6 paragraphs all of the history of the organization, the list of recent achievements, except for maybe the one that we thought this funder would care about the most based on what we knew about them. Anyway, so you can see where I'm going with this. We took a lot out of there, and we were very precise about what it is we were looking for at that point in time from the funder. Now, that won't be the exact approach or writing style that each of you might want to take. For instance, if you work for an academic institution, you may not be writing with a punchy style, or not too punchy of a style, because your organization might have a different tone that it uses. But you see where I'm going. To create very succinct ways of messaging, whether it's by phone or even frankly in video meetings, there are just ways to communicate that really script and narrow the target of your messaging to make sure that it's right in line with exactly what your funder needs to know, and that you don't go on and on, but that you're doing listening when it's verbal, and that you are only writing about what you think the organization really needs to know at that stage. So we put so much time into these early messaging systems, and in most cases, it really makes a huge difference. You can probably imagine how this kind of rework helps your application stand out, because it is more likely to get noticed. And even if you're at a place where you can't apply, I'm going back to that last question, if you're waiting to be invited, you know, some element of what you're submitting will be recognized. And then maybe you'll be invited to speak with the funder or submit an application. So I'm going to ask, for the purposes of your matrix there, to consider your largest prospect right now. Okay, be very specific about which one you're thinking about. Have you attempted to get in front of that funder with something other than the letter of intent or the proposal itself? If not, what initial step can you take? Email, voicemail, seeking out a connection among your colleagues or maybe your board members. And again, I'm not just talking about any email or voicemail. I'm talking about a succinct, strategic, powerful email. If you have tried this kind of thing, have you attempted different approaches in style or in format, meaning email versus phone, and so forth? Excuse me. We're going to talk a little bit more about this topic in a few minutes, but also think about what differentiators of all the things you currently tell your funders up front, what is the one that you think would mean the most to them? It's really good to think of that as well. Okay, so let's move on to aspiration. And I like the visual of this fancy car here as something that I think makes a good parallel. When we're talking about aspiration, we're going back to what we spoke of earlier, which is planning and your nonprofit's vision. And I think this idea of a high-end car illustrates well what we mean by aspiration. Because if you love cars and I love cars, it doesn't mean that we both want to own this particular fancy car, because as beautiful as it is, maybe you think, or I think, that this car is it. If of all cars, I would want this one. But you may, as a car lover, feel like you want to focus your car collection on electric cars. And so in that vein, we have a similar vision. We both love cars, but our ways of getting there are different, right? So when the visions diverge a little bit, the question is, how can you and your funder overcome that? And really, for me, the question is, do you and your funder, even though it seems like you are both into health and bettering wellness, do you both see that in the same vein? So the question is, let me just tell you the answer. In my humble opinion, major grants are all about making the most efficient use of your time. So sometimes when you think that you both have the same vision, you really need to dial back a little bit and make sure that your way of arriving at that vision is similar enough to warrant your time on these, let's face it, your most time-consuming solicitations. So you want to both conduct a lot of due diligence on these funders and then determine whether the differences are deal breakers. You know, if you suspect that something is a deal breaker, first of all, please do not bend your organization's culture or ethos for that grant. I've seen that happen and it does not turn out well. So keeping in line your moral compass and that of your nonprofit, think about an example like this. One nonprofit that I worked with began with on that wellness track. They were both focused on wellness, the funder and the nonprofit. Their visions diverged in this way. The funder was very focused on data, so was the nonprofit. But this was at the beginning of COVID, and this is not a COVID specific example, but the nonprofit went to the funder and saw from everything on its website and had talked to even some other grantees and learned that this funder wants usually 6 months to a year's worth of data before it will fund something. And this organization was in the business of establishing health clinics in impoverished communities. And it had begun a telehealth component of those health clinics pre-pandemic, but only a couple of months before the pandemic began. So when this nonprofit wanted to go to the funder and submit a proposal in COVID to really expand this telehealth initiative, the funder said, well, we really need some data related to how that telehealth aspect is working for you. And the nonprofit said, we've got to be honest, we don't have it right now because we just pivoted to telehealth. And this funder was pretty staunch about the fact that that would not bode well for the proposal. So they said, you're welcome to still apply if you'd like, but we're just telling you that data is really key. So what the nonprofit decided to do was to step back for a year, and collect the data and then come back and apply at that point. You can imagine that was somewhat devastating in the moment because the moment was COVID and the need was great, but it became more important at that point to focus elsewhere and see where they could get funding from a funder that was going to be more amenable to the immediate vision that nonprofit had and its immediate plans. You might be wondering, how did they get that feedback from the funder? And it was in a brief, succinct email that said very explicitly, we plan to apply, here's the problem we foresee, what can we do about it? And even though they did not get or even submit a grant in that funding round, that exchange did lay the groundwork for the point when a year later they went back with data and were able to secure a grant. So it was nice to have that connection, even though it didn't start out as well as they had hoped. So how can you make your application stand out related to these aligned or sometimes divergent aspirations? I think the key point here is you want to understand as fully as possible the nuances involved in a potential funder's aspirations. So as you look at your matrix, the questions you'll want to answer are, do you have in place a system to determine early in your solicitation process how well your vision aligns with that of the funder? And of course, we're not just talking that top line vision of, say, wellness, but down from there, do you have a good idea from reading and talking about this funder what it is exactly they're looking for under that umbrella of the big discipline of something like wellness? If not, consider something like an internal checklist or other process that ensures that you either have full alignment or that you have the kind of connection to a funder, or you develop the kind of connection that allows you to really understand what it is this funder wants. Again, not possible in every case, but when we're talking about your top 5 or so % of major grant makers, you really can save a lot of time by spending a little bit of it on this area. If you do have a system to determine alignment, terrific. The question in that case is, can you tighten it up a little bit? Does it include not just determining similarities, but also differences? And do you have a way to hash out whether those differences are enough of a deal breaker to move you into another funding cycle or to move on? And do you do your due diligence around those differences, right? Are you talking to colleagues when you need to determine whether these pieces are deal breakers? And are you communicating with funders, as in the example I just cited? Okay, we're going through a lot here. So take your last cup of caffeine or swig of caffeine, I guess. Another cup might put you over the edge. And advocacy is our last topic here. Is your team working with the necessary persistence? Persistence is key. I think it's been an underlying factor to everything we've talked about today. And advocacy in this case gets to the idea that you cannot do the awareness or the aspirational work that we've talked about today without persistence. The biggest mistake, the biggest that I see with major grants prospects is that grant seekers give up too soon. Let's say a call to the funder doesn't get returned, an email doesn't get answered, and people move on to the next prospect. I completely understand how that works, but when we go back to what we spoke about early related to major gifts, most major gifts officers will tell you it takes about 18 months to secure a major gift. And I'm going to say, in my experience, that the major grants equivalent isn't too far off from that. In one example, a client was, we went through the whole alignment and aspirational piece we just talked about, and these two organizations, the nonprofit and funder, were aligned in almost every way possible. And what we ended up with was a series of brief, well-planned messages that lasted in total about 15 months. And these were first a series of email exchanges, and then it was a brief phone call, and then it was a longer phone call inviting the nonprofit to apply for a grant. Excuse me. And I won't belabor the story because I want to make sure we have time for some questions in the end, but eventually that grant did come about, and it was large and got larger over time. So how do you make your application stand out related to your persistence? You absolutely must advocate for your confidence in the partnership with that funder. Make sure that they know that you see this as someplace where you've done your homework and you have a lot of confidence that you and this funder really stand to be good long-term partners. Remember, these are major grants, so as you look at your matrix, you're only talking about the top tier of your foundation's portfolio. So do you have reminders set for those major grant makers so that you don't think about them only in the lead up to the applications? I mean, I'm thinking 3 to 4 times a year. You want to think of something that is honestly not always your mailing list, where these funders are hearing from you. So consider setting some reminders if you haven't done that. Does your leadership at your nonprofit understand the need to develop these relationships in a similar vein as they do for high net worth individuals? And if not, you might include this idea on the agenda for your next grants gathering. So there we go. It takes us full circle. So again, I hope you've been able to fill out this matrix with at least some real specific next steps for yourself, because similar to establishing a culture of philanthropy, as we've talked about for years in this field, I think it takes just diligence over time, talk about persistence and getting a solid major grants strategy together. You change your organization's mindset from one of it's the grants person's job to more of a communal one. Is there anything you want to ask related to that funder related piece? I'm gonna
There
say,
are,
yeah.
so a lot of people had questions that I was answering behind the scenes around, how do you kind of break in? How do you make sure you have relationships? And I did suggest, knowing someone. We always talk about the fact that, your board may know someone in leadership in these different organizations. So that's always a good thing to check out. You might be surprised.
Yeah.
But then we also had questions about, just awareness. So Megan wanted to know, can you give specific examples of how to be seen?
How to be seen on from your
Yeah.
funders. Yes, I mean, I'll say that one client I know has done a phenomenal job literally getting in front of funders by presenting at conferences that funders attend. And that came from just one contact that they had. It was a board member who ended up working for a funding entity, and they learned about all of the conferences that the relevant funders had, and they present at those at those gatherings when they can. This is not a daily event for sure, but they've gotten grants from funding organizations that call them up. So it's another way beyond the ones we mentioned where you can literally get in front of funders.
Great. And I have to mention GuideStar and your GuideStar profile because right now so many more organizations are looking at GuideStar and saying, I can't possibly know every organization that I may want to donate to, but I can go into GuideStar and look for, categories of organizations and see all of their information right there. So if you don't know what GuideStar is, please go to guidestar.org, go to candid.org, learn more about your profile because organizations are searching for, who's the next great organization that I can give money to, who's working in the field that, that we're interested in. And they can do those searches without knowing exactly who you are on GuideStar. So if your profile is up to date and they run into you, that's like, magic and really awesome. So did you want to wrap up one more thing before we just go to questions? Because we're almost done.
I know time has flown. I do just want to make sure that everyone has my contact information so that if we don't get to your question today, feel free to send it to me. Resource Partners Online, Susan at resourcepartnersonline.com. Again, my newsletter, I will not be bothering you other than this once a month newsletter. So it would be great to share ideas both ways. I'd love to give you some of mine and hear your observations. So that's it. Thanks for joining us. And then we'll take some more questions, Yvonne, as long as
Yes.
you want to hang on.
Yes, absolutely. So Habib wanted to know what budgetary implications ought to be considered as requests for major grants are planned and prepared. What are those items to consider vis-a-vis an organization budget so as to optimize the chances of getting funded?
Yeah, I assume you're talking about organizational budget. And I'll be
Yes.
honest, I'm not exactly sure what that, if I'm on target with that question, so you can feel free to message me if I'm not on target. But if you're talking about the amount of the grant, then it's, yes, sometimes funders do care that they don't want to fund over a certain percentage of your budget. I mean, certainly not over 30%, and many of them fall even less than that. But for the most part, I would look to see, use GuideStar to find the funders 990s and see the average size grants, knowing that you probably are not going to land at the high end right away. And so it's probably more about the funders giving history than it might be your own budget. But if I'm misunderstanding the question, feel free to message me.
But I just want to wrap up with the one more question. Are there any books, resources, anything else you suggest, and this is from Janice, for listing different strategy models?
Strategy models, my gosh, there are a lot of good books about grant seeking. Um, but what I do want to clarify is I don't know any that focus on the major grants that really push you to the next level. And if I'm being very candid about it, to use a perfectly good pun today, I that is why I started this newsletter, because I just myself wasn't finding a lot to read about those largest grants. There's a lot for about grant writing and about introductory strategies, but I don't personally find a lot of books that have been written on this topic. So hopefully the major grants articles that I'm writing are addressing that right now. So I'm sorry, I was in the same boat as you,
No,
as someone who's looking for it.
that is perfect, Susan. So that's Susan's humble brag. And the opportunity is there to look at what you have, and that's wonderful. So please, people, please do sign up or message Susan so that you can get that important information. And with that, I want to say thank you, Susan, again for sharing your expertise with us. And everyone have a great rest of your day.